More than 100 years ago, a small wooden ship pushed into the southern ice. Its crew believed they were prepared. They had maps, they had radios, they had enough food to last through the winter, and then the world became very quiet. The last message they sent was calm. Nothing was wrong. The ice was holding. No one ever heard from them again. Today, Antarctica is still the most isolated place on Earth, not just far away, but far from help. It is larger than Europe, covered almost entirely by ice, and in some places, that ice is more than 3 kilometers thick, so heavy it presses the land beneath it downward. From above, it looks empty, just white and wind, but beneath that frozen surface are valleys, mountains, and long, winding coastlines, a real landscape buried. Winds can sweep across it faster than a hurricane. Temperatures can drop so low that metal becomes brittle, and in winter, the sun disappears for months at a time. People have crossed oceans to reach this place. They have built camps on ice, flown planes over endless white, set down footprints that were meant to last. Some of those footprints never came back. Across Antarctica, pieces of these journeys still remain. A ship frozen into the sea, a plane slowly sinking under snow, a camp that once held warmth, now erased by drifting ice. Not destroyed, just taken. So why does Antarctica so often leave nothing behind? What happens when human plans meet a land that does not care about them? How can entire expeditions fade away without wreckage, signals, or clear answers? And what is the ice still holding beneath all that silence? Tonight, we drift gently into a place that does not just challenge survival, but slowly removes it from memory. But before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what the time is there. It is always fascinating to think of these stories being heard across so many different skies. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into Earth's mysteries, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps other curious dreamers find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and together, let's step into the quietest place on Earth. The danger of Antarctica does not come from a single dramatic force. It grows quietly from the way the continent sits on the planet, lifted higher, colder, and farther from the rest of the world than anywhere else humans try to live. Much of Antarctica rests on a vast plateau of ice that rises thousands of meters above sea level, turning the interior into a frozen high desert. Air thins as it climbs, moisture disappears, and every breath carries less warmth. Cold there is not only a temperature, but a condition that drains energy, patience, and time from anyone who stays too long. Because the air holds almost no moisture, Antarctica is technically the driest continent on Earth. Snow falls lightly, but what does arrive never truly leaves. It compacts layer by layer, becoming ice that reflects sunlight and pushes heat away. Without oceans nearby to soften the seasons, temperatures fall to extremes that feel detached from the rest of the planet. Metals stiffen, fuels thicken, plastics fracture, and the simple act of standing still begins to cost more than it gives. The body works harder just to remain intact, burning calories and warmth even while resting. Isolation deepens this quiet threat. Antarctica has no cities beyond its edges, no roads reaching in from elsewhere, no nearby populations to call on when something goes wrong. Everything that enters must be planned months ahead and delivered by ship or aircraft during short windows of acceptable weather. When those windows close, the continent becomes a sealed space. Storms can stretch for days, sometimes weeks, filling the sky with moving white that erases the horizon and folds distance into nothing. During those moments, even experienced pilots and navigators lose their bearings, not from panic, but from the simple absence of visual reference. Rescue, in such a place, rarely moves quickly. Aircraft require precise conditions to land and take off, and those conditions can vanish without warning. Ships move slowly through ice that shifts with wind and current, sometimes blocking passages that were clear only hours before. Communication systems, strong elsewhere, weaken near the poles where satellites skim low across the sky. Messages become delayed, distorted, or lost altogether, turning emergencies into isolated events known only to the people living inside them. Survival depends on timing so exact that small errors compound fast. A storm arriving half a day early can halt progress. A mechanical failure that would be manageable elsewhere becomes final when spare parts are days away. Machines must run constantly to keep fuel warm, batteries charged, and shelters livable. Once engines stop, cold settles in with remarkable speed, seeping through layers of insulation and turning stillness into a countdown. Human endurance here is inseparable from technology, and when one falters, the other soon follows. Even the landscape resists familiarity. Ice flows slowly, almost imperceptibly, carrying camps and markers away from where they were placed. Snow smooths over tracks, making yesterday's path invisible by morning. Landmarks disappear beneath accumulation, leaving behind a surface that appears unchanged, even after years have passed. To live and move in Antarctica requires constant adjustment, repeated recalibration, and an acceptance that nothing stays fixed for long. This is how Antarctica becomes lethal without spectacle, not through sudden violence, but through accumulation. Cold layered upon altitude, isolation layered upon cold, distance layered upon every decision made too early or too late. People do not fail there all at once. They are worn down gradually by a place that offers no margin, no shortcuts, and no reassurance. The continent remains patient, unchanged by human effort, waiting quietly as plans are tested against time, weather, and the fragile endurance of both flesh and machine. Long before Antarctica became a place of research stations and satellite maps, it was reached only by wooden hulls and patient guesswork. The first ships that pushed south did not carry certainty with them. They carried charts full of blank space, instruments that behaved strangely near the pole, and crews who understood that once the sea ice closed, the world behind them might as well no longer exist. These expeditions did not travel toward a destination so much as they drifted toward an idea, a belief that the edge of the map could be crossed and returned from. The ice they encountered was not the solid continent itself, but a moving skin spread across the ocean. Pack ice formed when wind and cold pressed floating sheets together, grinding them into ridges and barriers that shifted constantly. A channel open in the morning could seal shut by nightfall. Ships threaded through narrow leads of dark water, sails furled, engines straining, every sound softened by snow and fog. Progress was slow and uncertain, measured not in miles but in patience. Some vessels vanished gradually rather than all at once. Logs recorded worsening conditions, tighter ice, days spent unable to move. Crews waited for pressure to ease, believing the sea would open again. Instead, floes pressed inward, squeezing hulls with steady force. Wood groaned, seams opened, and seawater crept inside, freezing as it entered. When abandonment became inevitable, lifeboats were lowered onto a surface that was no longer ocean, but not yet land. From there, records thin and finally stop, leaving only the suggestion of movement across a surface that erased footsteps almost as soon as they were made. Other ships disappeared without leaving any written trace at all. They sailed south into fog banks and were never seen again by another human eye. No wreckage washed north. No lifeboats were found along distant shores. The sea ice did not release what it took, and the currents did not return evidence. In a time before regular communication, absence was the only signal available. A ship overdue became a mystery, and then slowly, a name carved into memory. What made these losses so complete was the environment itself. When a vessel was crushed or trapped, it rarely sank in open water. Instead, it became part of the ice, frozen in place and carried slowly by the drifting pack. Over months and years, pressure broke hulls apart, snow buried fragments, ice thickened above them, sealing wood, iron, and personal belongings into layers that moved like a slow river. The seafloor beneath remained far below, untouched by wreckage that never reached it. Navigation offered little help. Compasses wandered. Landmarks were temporary. Shorelines shifted under ice shelves that calved and reformed. Without accurate position fixing, even a ship's last known location was often an estimate, a broad circle drawn on a chart rather than a point. Search expeditions that followed found only more ice, rearranged by seasons and storms that cared nothing for yesterday's paths. Over time, the silence surrounding these ships grew heavier than their cargo. They did not become famous disasters marked by debris fields or eyewitness accounts. They simply faded, absorbed into a southern ocean that moved constantly, yet revealed almost nothing. The ice did not announce its victories, it held them quietly, turning human journeys into hidden layers beneath a surface that looked unchanged to those who came later, calm and unbroken, stretching outward as if no one had ever tried to cross it at all. As ships pushed deeper into southern waters, the ocean gradually changed its behavior. Open waves softened into slush, then into flat, pale sheets that drifted silently past the hull. Antarctic sea ice did not arrive with sudden force. It gathered patiently, forming outward from countless crystals that locked together and spread across the surface. What looked thin and fragile from a distance could quickly become dense enough to resist steel and timber alike, tightening its grip with every drop in temperature. Pack ice rarely stayed still. Driven by wind and current, it pressed together and pulled apart in slow, unpredictable rhythms. Ships that moved confidently through open leads could find themselves surrounded hours later, the water closing as if stitched shut. Once trapped, engines offered little help. Propellers churned against resistance that did not break but absorbed energy, freezing again as soon as motion stopped. Crews learned that force meant very little against a surface that behaved more like land than sea. Winter deepened this confinement. Darkness settled for months, and with it came colder air and thicker ice. What had been a temporary delay became a long pause, then a season of waiting. Supplies were rationed, routines formed around maintenance and survival rather than travel. Hulls were inspected daily, listening for changes in sound, the subtle signals of pressure building beyond visibility. Ice pushed slowly, almost gently, but with strength distributed across entire surfaces rather than single points. When pressure increased, ships did not fail immediately. They bent and complained first, beams warped, nails loosened. Planks separated by fractions too small to see but large enough for freezing water to enter. That water expanded, widening gaps with every cycle of thaw and refreeze. Over time, the ship became a frozen object itself, its structure locked to the surrounding ice, moving wherever the pack decided to go. Years could pass this way. Some crews survived long enough to watch familiar stars return to the sky, only to realize the ice had not released them. Drifting pack carried ships in slow arcs across the polar sea, far from planned routes and known landmarks. Navigation lost meaning when there was no direction to steer. The ship existed inside a moving field, not traveling through it but embedded within it. Eventually, many hulls reached their limit. Pressure ridges rose around them like walls, their weight transferred downward. Wooden ships were especially vulnerable. Built to flex against waves, they could not withstand sustained compression from all sides. As the ice tightened, keels lifted, frames cracked, and seams split wide enough to end hope of recovery. When collapse came, it was rarely sudden. The structure yielded piece by piece until the vessel no longer resembled something made for travel. Crews who abandoned ship stepped onto a surface that offered no clear boundary between safety and danger. The ice beneath their feet shifted constantly, cracking open without warning or closing again behind them. Camps formed nearby, close enough to salvage supplies, far enough to avoid immediate collapse. From there, survival became an exercise in patience rather than movement. Food lasted only as long as it lasted. Resupply depended on chance encounters with passing ships that often never came. What remains remarkable is how little trace these years left behind. When ships were finally destroyed, their fragments scattered within the ice and sank gradually as conditions changed. Snow buried what floated. Drift carried pieces far from their origin. Time smoothed away edges and erased evidence, leaving only ice where life once gathered. This closing in was not an act of violence but of persistence. Sea ice did not rush or rage. It surrounded, compressed, and waited. Human effort slowed within it, then stopped entirely, absorbed into a system that moved on long after voices fell quiet. The ocean returned to its pale stillness, carrying forward without memory of the shapes it had held so carefully for so long. When exploration moved inland, the signs of human presence grew quieter. Camps rose not from ports but from temporary clearings carved into snow and ice. Tents, wooden huts, and later prefabricated buildings were placed with care, aligned against prevailing winds, anchored with cables and ice screws. At first, these sites felt stable. Walls blocked the cold. Stoves hummed. Instruments ticked gently through the long hours, measuring a continent that seemed still enough to hold a promise. Antarctica answered with patience. Snow did not fall here in dramatic storms alone. It arrived steadily, grain by grain, carried sideways by wind that rarely rested. What settled around a camp did not melt away with the sun. It accumulated, packing itself tight, smoothing edges, filling corners. Doorways narrowed, windows dimmed. The ground rose slowly, as if the land itself were breathing in. Crews adapted as long as adaptation remained possible. Snow was shoveled away daily, flags were raised higher, rooflines were reinforced, yet the work never ended. Each cleared surface invited new deposition, each exposed edge gathered drifts that leaned inward. Over weeks and months, buildings became less visible, not because they collapsed, but because the surrounding environment climbed to meet them. Field camps were especially vulnerable. Set up for short seasons, they relied on clear weather and regular resupply. When schedules shifted or conditions worsened, departure sometimes came sooner than planned, sometimes later. Equipment was left behind deliberately, to be recovered on a return that felt certain at the time. Tents collapsed under snow load. Storage barrels were lashed together. Locations were marked carefully, coordinates recorded in notebooks and memory. Antarctica continued its quiet work after people left. Snow-filled depressions where footprints once crossed. Ice beneath the surface flowed slowly, bending landscapes over years and decades. A camp placed on what seemed like solid ground was often resting on a moving sheet, imperceptibly drifting downslope. Buildings tilted, anchors loosened, structures fractured along stress points, too gradual to notice from one day to the next. Some stations were built to last through winters, even years. They hosted researchers who lived within narrow routines, protected by walls layered thick with insulation. When those stations were abandoned, they stood for a time as monuments of stillness. Antennas pointed into pale skies, doors creaked in wind, then snow climbed their sides, swallowing lower levels first, then entire rooms. Roofs sank under weight, collapsing inward and sealing spaces filled with papers, tools, and personal traces of daily life. Recovery proved difficult even when records existed. The surface of Antarctica is a moving archive that does not preserve entrances. A site buried one season might lie meters deeper the next. Markers were lost. GPS coordinates aged poorly as ice drifted beneath them. Search teams arriving years later often found nothing but smooth snow where structures had once stood, the outline erased as neatly as a brushed canvas. What disappears here is not destroyed in a traditional sense. Camps remain, sealed within layers of cold, reshaped by pressure and time. Materials degrade slowly in the absence of moisture and warmth, frozen in positions that suggest interruption rather than ending. Yet to those who return looking for them, the absence feels complete. The landscape offers no contrast, no disturbance to suggest what lies below. Through this process, Antarctica absorbs human effort without ceremony. Buildings become part of the ice, their presence translated into thickness and flow rather than ruins and rubble. Life that once gathered around stoves and radios fades into the background of a continent that moves continuously, quietly rearranging itself, leaving the surface calm and unbroken, as if the camps had never been there at all. When aircraft first began crossing Antarctica, they brought a new sense of reach to a continent that resisted being reached. Planes skimmed above ice that ships could not penetrate and traveled farther inland than any surface expedition before them. From the air, the land appeared calm and simplified, a vast sheet of white interrupted only by shadows and light. It was an environment that looked easy to read, almost gentle, as long as the sky remained clear. That clarity could vanish without warning. Whiteouts formed when low clouds, falling snow, and reflected light blended together, erasing contrast completely. Horizon, ground, and sky dissolved into a single pale field. To the human eye, depth disappeared, distance collapsed. What remained was brightness without shape, a world with no edges to hold on to. Inside the cockpit, instruments still functioned, but the view outside offered nothing to confirm them. Pilots relied on visual cues more than they realized. In familiar landscapes, the brain constantly compares motion against trees, terrain, and buildings. In Antarctica, those references did not exist. Ice stretched endlessly in every direction, smooth and uniform. When clouds lowered, even subtle shadows vanished. Without a visible horizon, the inner ear took over, feeding sensations shaped by motion and vibration rather than reality. Level flight could feel like a climb. A gentle turn could feel like stability. This disconnect led to spatial disorientation, a quiet condition that unfolded slowly. The aircraft did not behave differently, but perception did. A pilot trusting sensation over instruments might correct for a movement that was not happening, tilting the aircraft slightly, then a little more. Each adjustment felt reasonable in the moment. The white outside the windows offered no contradiction. In some cases, the ground rose to meet the plane without ever becoming visible. Ice slopes and hidden ridges blended seamlessly into cloud. A descent that seemed controlled became final only at the moment of impact. There was often no warning sound beyond the steady hum of engines. Crashes left little trace from the air, only snow disturbed briefly before wind softened the edges again. Even when aircraft were lost, locating them proved difficult. Whiteouts that hid terrain also hid wreckage. Debris scattered across snowfields that shifted continuously. Fresh snowfall buried evidence quickly, smoothing over scars within days or weeks. Signals from emergency beacons weakened at high latitudes or were masked by terrain beneath ice. Search flights passed overhead, scanning a surface that offered no sign of disturbance. Time deepened the erasure. Snow packed down over twisted metal. Ice crept forward, carrying wreckage away from recorded positions. What had been a precise flight path became an approximation, then a memory. Expeditions searching years later found nothing but uniform terrain, the crash sites absorbed into the slow movement of the ice sheet itself. What makes these disappearances especially quiet is how ordinary they seemed at first. Flights took off as planned, crews followed procedures, weather forecasts offered narrow windows of opportunity. Then, visibility narrowed, perception shifted, and the landscape removed its references. There was no dramatic struggle recorded, only a gradual separation between human senses and the world they attempted to read. Antarctica does not need to strike aircraft from the sky. It only needs to become visually empty. In that emptiness, machines continue forward, guided by systems that demand constant interpretation. When interpretation slips, even briefly, the continent accepts what enters it, covering the result gently and completely. From above, the surface soon looks untouched again, white and unbroken, holding within it the quiet imprint of flight paths that ended not in chaos, but in silence. Sound travels differently at the bottom of the world, and so does silence. When radios followed ships and camps into Antarctica, they seemed to promise connection, a thin but steady thread linking isolated crews to voices far beyond the ice. Signals crackled through headphones, steady and reassuring, carried by invisible paths across air and sky. As long as the transmissions arrived, distance felt manageable, almost small. Those paths were never simple. Near the poles, Earth's magnetic field bends sharply downward, shaping the upper atmosphere into layers that shift constantly. Radio waves that would travel cleanly elsewhere scatter, refract, or slip away entirely. Sometimes they bounce long distances, sometimes they vanish into space. Communication becomes dependent on timing, frequency, and the quiet cooperation of solar conditions no one on the ground can see. Crews learned this gradually. Messages that arrived clearly 1 hour faded into static the next. Words stretched, broke apart, or returned as echoes of themselves. Operators adjusted dials, changed antennas, logged times carefully. Most interruptions felt temporary. The expectation was always that clarity would return, that the silence was only a pause. Final transmissions often sounded ordinary. Reports of weather, routine updates, brief confirmations of position. There was rarely urgency in the phrasing. Crews spoke with the calm efficiency shaped by repetition and trust in procedure. When contact ended, it did not announce itself as an ending. The next scheduled message simply did not arrive. At first, stations assumed delay. Atmospheric noise was common. Equipment failed in the cold. Batteries drained faster than expected. Hours passed, then days. Static filled the spaces where voices had been. Attempts to re-establish contact met only faint signals or none at all. Without confirmation, concern formed slowly, shaped by habit rather than alarm. The fading of signals did not always reflect sudden disaster. In some cases, antennas iced over, power systems weakened. A single broken component silenced an entire camp, yet the result was the same. Once transmission stopped, the outside world lost its ability to observe. Antarctica became a closed room, its occupants unheard beyond its walls. Search efforts faced the same limits. Radio direction finding relied on signal strength and consistency, both unreliable so close to the pole. Positions last transmitted were often approximate, shaped by drifting ice or navigation errors accumulated over time. With no further updates, maps filled with circles instead of points. Silence expanded outward from each unanswered call. Solar activity added another layer of uncertainty. Charged particles streaming from the sun can disrupt the ionosphere, swallowing radio waves without warning. These events leave no visible trace on the ground. Crews beneath clear skies experienced sudden communication loss while unaware of the cause. From their perspective, nothing changed except the absence of response. As days turned into weeks, silence hardened into permanence. Radios continued to sit ready, switches unchanged, headphones waiting. Snow gathered around antennas, wind carved gentle shapes into cables. Inside huts and tents, instruments recorded temperatures and pressures long after voices fell quiet. The equipment remained, but the connection was gone. What lingers in records today are fragments, partial logs, times noted beside unanswered calls, transcripts that end mid-routine rather than mid-sentence. The absence of panic is often what stands out most, the sense that the final moments passed unnoticed, folded into daily rhythm rather than marked by alarm. In Antarctica, silence is not always empty. It is shaped by physics, distance, and the limits of technology, meeting a place that bends signals as easily as it bends ice. When radio messages stopped, the continent did not announce their end. It simply allowed them to fade, leaving behind a quiet space where communication once flowed and where nothing returned to replace it. When concern finally hardened into certainty, rescue teams began their careful approach toward absence. They followed coordinates recorded days or weeks earlier, numbers that once Pointa deemed precise and now felt fragile. Aircraft traced wide arcs over white ground. Ships edged forward through ice corridors that shifted as soon as they appeared. Each effort carried quiet discipline rather than urgency, shaped by the understanding that Antarctica does not yield quickly to arrival. The first impressions were often deceptively calm. From above, the surface showed no sign of disturbance. Snow lay smooth, shaped only by wind. Shadows stretched gently across low ridges. The land did not reflect the weight of loss carried toward it. Landing parties moved slowly, scanning for contrast in a place defined by uniformity. Every dark speck drew attention until it resolved into rock, shadow, or drifting ice. At last known campsites, teams found the landscape rearranged. Markers were gone or buried. Flags that once stood tall were snapped or submerged. In some cases, the ground itself had shifted, ice carrying the site several meters or more from where it had been recorded. The past survived only as a general region rather than a fixed point, and the search widened accordingly. Occasionally, fragments surfaced, a fuel drum half buried at an angle, a crate exposed along one edge, pieces of fabric stiffened by cold, their color muted by frost. These finds suggested presence without offering explanation. They did not point clearly in any direction. Snow-filled footprints long before searchers arrived, removing the most basic record of movement. Rescue teams were trained to read subtle clues, but Antarctica limited what could be read at all. Wind erased tracks daily. Snowfall smoothed surfaces evenly, disguising depressions. Crevasses hid beneath thin layers, forcing careful movement and narrowing search paths. What remained visible rarely stayed that way for long. The continent appeared to tidy itself continuously, returning each disturbed space to silence. Even when wreckage existed nearby, locating it required remarkable chance. An aircraft fuselage could lie only meters below the surface, invisible beneath accumulated snow. A collapsed hut might remain intact beneath layers of drift, sealed and unreachable without heavy equipment rarely available in search conditions. Time, weather, and logistics shaped how long teams could remain before conditions closed in again. Reports written afterward reflected restraint. Crews documented what they saw without embellishment, areas searched, visibility conditions, objects found and not found. Language remained careful, acknowledging uncertainty rather than resolving it. In many cases, official conclusions accepted that recovery was no longer possible, not because effort failed, but because the environment had already moved beyond retrieval. The absence weighed differently than destruction would have. There were no clear boundaries to mark where events ended. Searchers stood in places where people had once worked, spoken, and slept, yet those moments left no outline to trace. The sense of arrival without encounter lingered, a meeting with a space that held memory without revealing it. When teams withdrew, the land resumed its gradual rearrangement. Snow softened tracks left by boots and vehicles. Wind sculpted new patterns across the surface. Any small signs uncovered during the search were slowly concealed again. Within weeks, sometimes days, the landscape returned to a state that suggested no interruption at all. These missions did not fail in their purpose. They reached the places they intended to reach. They searched with patience and care. What they encountered was not emptiness, but completeness of a different kind, a system that absorbs traces and refuses to keep them exposed. Antarctica did not oppose rescue teams. It simply offered nothing in return, leaving them to depart with careful records and the quiet knowledge that sometimes finding nothing is the only possible outcome. What appears frozen in Antarctica is rarely still. The ice that blankets the continent behaves less like a solid surface and more like a slow, immense current. Snow that falls in the interior settles gently, year after year, pressing the layers beneath it. Over time, that pressure transforms soft crystals into dense ice, and the weight above urges everything below to begin a gradual journey outward. This movement is measured in quiet distances. Some regions advance only a few centimeters each year. Others, known as ice streams, slide forward far more quickly, guided by hidden valleys in the rock beneath. From above, nothing seems to change. The surface remains smooth and pale, yet deep within, ice deforms and flows, bending around obstacles with patience rather than force. Gravity provides the steady pull. The interior of Antarctica rises high above the surrounding seas, and ice slowly descends toward the coast. Along the way, it carries whatever lies within it. A camp buried by snowfall does not simply rest where it was built. It begins to travel, sealed inside layers that creep downslope, its position drifting away from recorded coordinates with each passing year. At the base of the ice, warmth from the earth and pressure from above can create thin films of water. This moisture acts like a lubricant, allowing massive sheets to slide over bedrock rather than remain locked in place. The motion is subtle but persistent, continuing through darkness and storm without pause. Nothing resting on the ice remains truly anchored. Wrecks caught in this system undergo a long transformation. A ship trapped near the coast may be crushed and buried, then carried laterally for kilometers over decades. A plane that disappears beneath snow becomes enveloped by layers that compress and move, breaking the structure apart slowly. Metal bends, materials fracture, each piece begins its own journey within the ice, separated and redistributed. Bodies follow the same quiet process. In the cold, change comes slowly. Preservation can last for years, even generations, but stillness does not. Ice closes around forms and draws them forward, deeper, and eventually downward. In some regions, ice flows toward exposed cliffs or the sea, where it fractures and calves away. What was once far inland may emerge briefly, altered and incomplete, before vanishing again into water or depth. This constant motion explains much of Antarctica's absence. The surface rarely holds on to the past. Objects do not remain where they fall. Markers placed carefully are carried off course. Coordinates age quickly. The land underneath remains hidden, and the ice above it rearranges everything placed upon it, smoothing evidence into the slow current of time. Even the scale of this movement resists intuition. A camp buried under several meters of snow might feel safely contained, yet it is already part of a conveyor that leads outward. Decades later, searchers arrive to find only empty terrain, unaware that the target now lies far beyond the search area, sealed deeper than tools can reach, or shifted into regions never associated with the original site. This flowing quality gives Antarctica a unique relationship with memory. The continent does not simply conceal, it transports, it repositions, it transforms presence into something mobile and distant. Human timelines move too quickly to notice this drift, while the ice proceeds at its own pace, uninterrupted and precise. Through this motion, the landscape remains deceptively calm. No cracks announce the journey. No visible paths trace the direction of travel. The ice carries its contents silently, reshaping the record of human arrival into a moving archive that rarely resurfaces. What disappears here does not vanish at once. It is taken up gently, folded into a system that flows continuously toward elsewhere, leaving behind a surface that appears unchanged, smooth, and entirely at rest. Across Antarctica's broad white surfaces lie features that remain unseen even at close range. Crevasse fields form where ice stretches, bends, and pulls apart as it moves across uneven ground beneath. These openings can be narrow as a footstep or wide enough to swallow buildings, yet from above they often appear invisible, softened by snow and flattened by light. The surface seems continuous, calm, and reliable, while beneath it the ice is quietly splitting. Crevasses open when stress builds within the ice sheet. As ice accelerates downhill or curves around buried ridges, tension concentrates along fault lines. The ice fractures vertically, sometimes descending tens of meters into darkness. Cold preserves their shape, preventing collapse, while wind carries loose snow across the openings, building thin bridges that disguise depth completely. What looks like solid ground becomes a cover stretched delicately across empty space. Travel through these areas requires careful knowledge and trust in instruments. Ropes are fixed between people. Vehicles move slowly, guided by ground-penetrating radar when available. Even with preparation, risk remains. Snow bridges can hold weight for years, then fail without warning as temperature, vibration, or added load weakens their structure. The change is sudden only at the surface. The failure itself has been developing quietly beneath. When a person falls into a crevasse, sound disappears quickly. The walls absorb echoes, and the opening above narrows to a thin line of light. Survival depends on many small conditions aligning: strength, equipment, and the ability to arrest the fall. Without immediate support, recovery becomes difficult within minutes. The cold preserves but also immobilizes, limiting movement as ice draws heat away steadily. Vehicles are not spared this hazard. Tracked machines distribute weight evenly, yet even they can trigger collapse when crossing fragile areas. When snow bridges fail under heavy loads, machines tip or drop, becoming wedged deep within the ice. Retrieval is rarely possible. The effort required to remove them often exceeds what conditions allow, and the crevasse continues its slow movement, carrying the wreck downward and forward over time. Aircraft face similar risks during landings and low altitude travel. Ski equipped planes rely on smooth, flat surfaces, and crevasse fields can masquerade as ideal runways. A hidden crack beneath a thin layer of snow can give way under the sudden weight of descent. The aircraft settles, tilts, then disappears partially or entirely into the opening. What remains above ground offers little indication of the depth below. What makes these places so effective at swallowing evidence is their concealment. Crevasses do not announce themselves. Light scatters across snow, erasing shadows that might reveal shape. In overcast conditions, contrast disappears altogether, turning the surface into a uniform field without reference or warning. Even experienced travelers can misjudge distance and solidity when visual cues vanish. Once something enters a crevasse, time begins another process of removal. Snow drifts inward from above. Ice edges deform and shift. The opening narrows or migrates as the glacier flows. Objects within are lowered gradually, their original position forgotten as the surface continues its steady movement. Records point to places that no longer match the landscape. These hidden spaces contribute to Antarctica's reputation for absence, not through violence, but through geometry and patience. The continent does not need storms to claim what crosses it. The ice itself contains openings where gravity does the rest, quietly and efficiently. Over seasons and years, the surface closes again, smooth and pale, leaving no mark of what passed there, only a continuous white plain that gives nothing back. Beneath Antarctica's smooth surface lies a landscape as complex as any on Earth. Long before ice claimed the continent, mountain ranges rose and eroded, valleys deepened, and peaks fractured under tectonic pressure. When snowfall began to accumulate and never retreat, these features were not erased. They were sealed away, preserved under kilometers of ice that softened their outlines but did not remove their height. From above, the ice sheet appears calm and level, a white skin stretched tightly across the land. Yet below it, mountains still stand, some rivaling the great ranges of other continents. Their presence is revealed only through subtle clues. Ice flows faster where slopes steepen. Surface ridges curve gently in places where bedrock rises. Satellites and radar maps hint at vast chains hidden in darkness, shaping the ice from below like hands pressed under cloth. For those traveling across Antarctica by air, these buried mountains pose a quiet danger. Aircraft move through a space where elevation is not easily perceived. The ice surface may sit thousands of meters above sea level already, reducing the margin between flight and terrain. Beneath that surface, rock rises even higher, unseen but very real. In clear conditions, pilots rely on visual contrast and known landmarks. Over Antarctica, both are limited. Cloud cover lowers without warning. Light reflects evenly off snow, removing shadows that usually define shape. In these moments, the surface gives little indication of what lies ahead. A gentle upward slope in the ice may signal a massive ridge beneath, but the transition is so smooth it goes unnoticed. Instruments may show rising ground, yet the lack of visual confirmation makes interpretation difficult. Some mountains come close to the surface, pushing ice upward into subtle domes. Others remain fully buried, their peaks still hundreds of meters below the ice sheet. In both cases, aircraft flying low to navigate or land pass over terrain that changes elevation invisibly. A descent planned for flat ice can intersect rising ground without any visible warning, especially when weather closes in and reference disappears. Radar altimeters provide data, but they measure distance to the ice surface, not the rock below. Maps improve constantly, yet gaps remain, especially in remote regions where surveys are incomplete or outdated. Early flights relied on limited charts, drawn from partial knowledge and educated guesswork. Even today, some areas hold uncertainties shaped by how difficult they are to study. When aircraft encounter these hidden ranges, the encounter is brief and final. There is often no sense of collision until the moment it occurs. Snow and ice absorb sound. Impact marks are quickly softened by drift. What remains above the surface is minimal, sometimes nothing at all. Search efforts arrive later to terrain that offers no sign of interruption, only gentle rises and falls that blend into the surrounding ice. Over time, the ice continues its movement. Wreckage becomes buried, then carried downslope along the same paths as everything else sealed within the ice sheet. The mountain remains, the aircraft disappears, and the surface resumes its quiet uniformity. The event leaves no scar that lasts long enough to guide others away. These buried ranges remind us that Antarctica is not empty beneath its ice. It is structured, layered, and complex, holding a full geology out of sight. The ice smooths its presence, disguises its sharpness, and invites the assumption of safety where none exists. Above this hidden terrain, human flight becomes an exercise in trust, dependent on knowledge that is always partial. The mountains wait patiently below, unchanged and unseen, shaping outcomes without ever revealing themselves. In Antarctica, not everyone who dies is brought home. Some crews came to rest in places so remote, so difficult to reach, that recovery was never attempted or could not be completed. Their presence remains part of the continent, not as marked graves or monuments, but as quiet additions to the landscape, absorbed into ice and distance. In many cases, death arrived during journeys already strained by weather, exhaustion, or failing equipment. Crews traveling far from established stations carried only what they needed to survive and return. When one life ended unexpectedly, the balance shifted. Continuing forward became impossible. Turning back demanded strength and time that might not exist. Decisions were made slowly, shaped by the limits of what the living could safely do. Antarctica's conditions narrow those choices. Carrying a body across ice requires effort far beyond normal travel. Cold stiffens limbs and clothing. Terrain fractures without warning. Weather closes routes abruptly. In these moments, survival for the remaining crew depends on reducing weight, shortening exposure, and conserving energy. Leaving someone behind becomes an act of necessity rather than intention. Where bodies were placed, they were positioned with care. Crevasses became natural resting places, deep and stable. Snow pits were carved and sealed. In some rare cases, shallow graves were dug where tools and ground allowed. There were no ceremonies shaped for permanence, only gestures of respect made quickly before conditions demanded movement again. Once left, the cold took over the work of preservation. Antarctica's dryness and low temperatures slow decay to a near standstill. Without moisture and warmth, biological processes pause. Bodies freeze where they lie, features softened by frost, but largely unchanged over time. Clothing remains intact. Equipment stays close, locked in the moment it was last used. Ice and snow then begin their gradual rearrangement. Drifts build, Surfaces rise. What was once visible becomes buried, then carried slowly by the same flowing ice that moves everything else. In some locations, remains have rested undisturbed for decades, sealed in stable cold, far from human contact. In others, they have migrated within the ice, shifted far from their original resting places without ever resurfacing. Why they remain is not only a matter of difficulty, but of policy shaped by experience. Modern expeditions recognize that recovery often carries more risk than leaving the dead at rest. Attempting retrieval can expose others to crevasses, storms, and mechanical failure. The decision to leave someone behind acknowledges the scale of the environment and the limits it sets on human action. In a continent without decay, in the familiar sense, the idea of permanence changes. The dead are not reclaimed by soil or vegetation. They remain suspended in cold, neither returning to the earth nor leaving it entirely. Their presence becomes part of Antarctica's deep stillness, a reminder of human arrival without imposing on the land itself. Occasionally, remains are discovered years later as ice shifts or thins. When this happens, responses are careful and deliberate. Some are recovered when conditions allow, others are reburied more securely. Each case is treated individually, guided by safety and respect rather than urgency. These crews are not remembered through markers on the ice. Their stories live in logs, reports, and quiet acknowledgments passed between those who work there. Antarctica does not display its history openly. It holds it internally, layered within ice and time. Those left behind rest in a place where change comes slowly, where memory is preserved not by visibility, but by cold, distance, and enduring stillness. In Antarctica, machines do not fail loudly. They slow, stiffen, and quietly withdraw their cooperation. What works reliably elsewhere begins to behave differently as cold settles into every component. Engines struggle to turn, metals resist movement, and systems designed for precision drift towards stillness. Technology that extends human reach becomes another element shaped by the continent rather than a solution standing apart from it. Cold thickens fluids first. Oils meant to lubricate engines grow heavy and sluggish, clinging instead of flowing. Fuel loses its willingness to ignite, refusing to vaporize properly in frigid air. Starters draw more power than batteries can give. An engine that ran smoothly the day before hesitates, then stops, not from damage, but from temperature alone. Restarting becomes uncertain, dependent on shelter, warmth, and time that may not exist. Batteries suffer most quietly of all. Chemical reactions slow as temperature drops, reducing capacity long before a battery appears empty. Equipment that reads as charged delivers little when called upon. Radios weaken, navigation tools dim, emergency beacons fade. Without heat, even backup systems shrink toward silence. Power becomes something that must be guarded constantly, rather than assumed. Metal itself changes character. Steel grows brittle, aluminum contracts, bolts seize in place, threads locking together so tightly that tools slip rather than turn. Rubber seals crack, hoses fracture when flexed. What once absorbed vibration begins to transmit it, shaking joints loose and spreading small failures outward. Repairs that would be simple elsewhere become delicate negotiations between frozen parts and limited dexterity. Human hands struggle to keep up. Thick gloves reduce precision. Exposed skin risks damage within moments. Tasks stretch longer, draining energy as cold pulls warmth away relentlessly. Each repair attempt consumes calories, focus, and daylight. When storms arrive or temperatures fall further, work stops altogether, leaving machines suspended between function and failure. These breakdowns ripple outward. A vehicle stuck on ice cannot be easily towed when others face the same limitations. Aircraft grounded by mechanical issues may remain so for entire seasons. Heating systems failing inside shelters shift priority from repair to survival. Time becomes the decisive factor. The longer a system remains inactive, the colder it becomes, and the harder revival grows. Rescue depends on machines functioning in sequence. Aircraft must start, take off, and land within narrow weather windows. Navigation relies on electronics that demand power. Communication requires stable signals and equipment that can withstand exposure. If any link fails, response slows or stops, distance expands. The continent's scale reasserts itself, turning delays into endings. Past expeditions learned this pattern through experience rather than theory. Records describe engines coaxed awake with improvised heaters, batteries warmed against bodies, parts rotated by hand to prevent seizing. Sometimes these efforts worked long enough to restore movement, sometimes they did not. When they failed, crews adapted as best they could, conserving energy and waiting for conditions to shift. In many cases, conditions never did. Machines remained where they stood, frozen into the landscape they were meant to overcome. Snow gathered around them, ice flowed beneath them. What began as a temporary malfunction became permanent immobility, closing off routes and narrowing options for everyone involved. Antarctica does not oppose technology directly, it simply subjects it to the same rules as everything else. Cold strips systems down to their limits, revealing how dependent motion is on warmth, flexibility, and balance. When machines stop working here, they do so gradually and thoroughly, and with their silence, the space for rescue often fades as well, leaving only patience, endurance, and the slow rearrangement of ice to follow. Across Antarctica, research stations were built as islands of routine in a continent that resists habit. They were placed with care on ice shelves, rocky outcrops, and interior plateaus, chosen for proximity to data rather than comfort. Inside, lights glowed against long darkness, radios murmured. Laboratories measured wind, ice, and sky with steady attention. For a time, these places felt stable, anchored by schedules and shared purpose. Evacuation arrived quietly. Sometimes it came at the end of a planned season, delayed flights finally lifting people away. Other times it followed structural strain, medical emergencies, or shifts in ice that made foundations uncertain. Decisions were measured and practical, equipment was packed, samples were labeled and stored. Doors were secured against weather that never truly relents. What could not be carried was left arranged for a return that seemed reasonable at the time. The return did not always come. Ice shelves advanced and fractured, runways softened or vanished under drift. Access routes grew unreliable as crevasses opened where none had been charted before. Buildings designed to endure cold proved less prepared for movement beneath them. Floors tilted, walls cracked, anchors loosened as the surface crept forward. In places, the ground itself changed category, from stable to transient, from safe to provisional. Politics and logistics shaped outcomes as much as weather. Funding shifted, priorities moved elsewhere, new stations were built closer to reliable access, leaving older sites behind. International cooperation expanded in some regions and narrowed in others. Maintaining isolated outposts required constant resupply, technical support, and personnel rotation. When those chains weakened, closure followed without drama. Once emptied, stations entered a different phase of existence. Snow accumulated against walls. Wind pushed fine grains through seams and vents. Interiors cooled to match the outside, preserving objects exactly as they were left. Desks held notebooks mid entry. Shelves carried instruments calibrated for conditions that would not return. Time paused without decay in the familiar sense. Ice continued its work around them. Drifts climbed steadily, lifting the apparent ground level until windows dimmed and doors disappeared. Roofs bore increasing load, sagging slowly before giving way. In some coastal regions, entire stations were carried seaward on ice shelves, their fate tied to calving fronts that fracture unpredictably. When the ice broke free, buildings traveled briefly, then vanished into water. Why some stations were never reopened becomes clear within this rhythm. Re-entry demanded certainty that no longer existed. Foundations might be compromised. Hazardous materials could be inaccessible beneath snow. Retrieving structures from moving ice posed risks greater than building anew elsewhere. Antarctica offers no advantage for preservation that demands use. What is not actively maintained becomes part of the landscape, absorbed rather than repaired. Occasional visits documented what remained. Photographs showed rooms softened by frost, corridors narrowed by encroaching snow. Equipment lay undisturbed, not broken but obsolete, locked to a moment already past. Reports noted stability concerns, access difficulties, and the growing cost of intervention. The decision to leave sites as they were reflected acceptance rather than neglect. These abandoned stations form a quiet network across the continent, markers of human curiosity set down and then released. They are not ruins in the traditional sense. They do not crumble into fragments or invite return. They fade by degrees, folded into ice and wind, redistributed by slow forces that do not hurry. In their absence, Antarctica remains what it has always been, a place that allows entry for a time, then resumes its own order, patient and unchanged by the structures that once stood briefly against its cold. Life in Antarctica narrows the world gently at first. Days become defined by routine, by small tasks repeated with care, by familiar faces moving through limited spaces. Outside, the landscape offers no variation to anchor the passing of time. White stretches outward in every direction, blending sky and ground into a single, unbroken presence. At a distance, this simplicity can feel calming. Over time, it begins to press inward. Silence is never complete, yet it dominates everything. Wind hums across structures. Ice shifts deep below the surface. Inside stations, ventilation systems murmur softly. What is missing is the layered sound of life, distant traffic, animals, irregular voices. The ear waits for variation that never arrives. In that absence, even the smallest noises take on weight. A dropped tool echoing longer than expected, footsteps sounding unusually loud, then gone. The endless white affects perception as steadily as the cold affects the body. Without color or contrast, depth becomes uncertain. Distance loses meaning. The horizon curves gently, but offers no landmarks to hold the eye. People learn to look inward instead, focusing on instruments, schedules, and one another. When those anchors weaken, the mind has little external structure left to rely on. Isolation deepens gradually. Communication with the outside world is limited by time and technology. Messages arrive delayed or brief, filtered through equipment and schedules. Loved ones exist as voices or text rather than presence. News from elsewhere can feel unreal, disconnected from the daily reality of ice, cold, and repetition. The sense of existing apart from the rest of the planet grows quietly, unnoticed until it has already taken hold. Psychological stress rarely appears as a single breaking point. It accumulates in small shifts. Sleep patterns change under months of darkness or constant daylight. Concentration drifts. Minor frustrations linger longer than they should. Social interactions grow more delicate, shaped by the knowledge that escape from one another is impossible. Each person carries not only their own weight, but the shared atmosphere of the group. Endurance depends on balance. Routine provides stability, yet too much sameness dulls thought. Solitude offers focus, yet prolonged isolation strains connection. The mind searches for novelty in a place designed by nature to offer very little of it. Memories replay, thoughts circle back on themselves. Without new sensory input, the past and the present blur together. Some people begin to withdraw inward. Others grow restless, pacing small spaces, seeking movement where none is required. Mood shifts emerge without clear cause. Sadness one day, irritation the next, then a flat calm that feels unfamiliar. These changes do not announce themselves as danger. They simply alter the texture of experience, making simple tasks feel heavier than before. The environment offers no reassurance. There is no softening of conditions, no gradual return to variety. The white remains. The silence persists. For those who struggle, the landscape mirrors their internal state, expansive and empty, reflecting thoughts back without interruption. Breaking down in Antarctica does not always mean collapse. More often, it is a slow erosion of resilience. The mind, like equipment and buildings, responds to constant pressure over time. When support systems weaken, even strong individuals feel the strain. The continent does not cause this through hostility. It does so through constancy, by asking the human psyche to exist without change, without distraction, and without relief. In that stillness, endurance becomes as delicate and complex as survival itself. Among the records kept from Antarctica are moments where routine unraveled quietly, not through storms or sudden loss, but through gradual shifts in behavior that others only recognized after they had already deepened. These cases did not begin with crisis. They began with subtle changes inside environments designed to minimize surprise and maximize order. Psychologists studying polar expeditions noticed patterns early on. Confined groups, long separation from familiar social networks, and an absence of natural cycles altered perception and judgment. Individuals who arrived calm and capable sometimes grew withdrawn or unusually animated. Speech patterns changed. Small disagreements lingered longer than before. Focus narrowed, then drifted. None of this appeared dramatic in isolation. Together, it reshaped how people experienced themselves and one another. In some documented cases, individuals began to misinterpret intentions. Neutral comments felt personal. Routine instructions sounded threatening. Trust weakened without clear cause. The close quarters of stations amplified these shifts. Privacy was limited. Silence from outside the walls left little distraction from internal thought. When tension rose, there was no physical distance available to reset it. Sleep disruption played a quiet role. Months without consistent darkness or daylight interfered with circadian rhythms. Rest became fragmented. Dreams bled into waking hours. Fatigue blurred judgment and lowered emotional tolerance. In this state, stress did not release overnight. It accumulated, carried forward each day as a constant presence. Historical accounts describe incidents where individuals wandered away from stations without clear plans, walking into white conditions with inadequate gear. Others sabotaged equipment, not from malice, but from distorted reasoning shaped by exhaustion and isolation. Some withdrew completely, refusing communication, remaining in small spaces for extended periods, convinced that interaction posed a threat. Medical evacuation was not always possible. Weather closed in, aircraft were grounded, teams adapted as best they could, redistributing responsibilities and watching closely for further change. In extreme cases, crews restrained or isolated individuals temporarily to prevent harm, decisions made carefully and reluctantly under difficult conditions. These moments were not failures of character. They reflected the limits of the human mind under sustained environmental pressure. Antarctica removes cues that normally regulate emotion and behavior. There is no variation in scenery to refresh attention. There are no crowds to dilute tension. Every interaction carries weight. Every change is noticed. Researchers later named clusters of symptoms associated with these experiences: irritability, cognitive slowing, emotional blunting followed by sudden intensity, detachment from shared goals. These effects were observed not only in Antarctica, but in submarines and space simulations, environments where isolation and confinement intersect. In Antarctica, these effects unfolded slowly enough to be mistaken for ordinary stress until they crossed invisible thresholds. By the time control was lost, the process had often been underway for weeks or months. Recovery required removal from the environment itself, not correction through discipline or instruction. What stands out in these cases is how rarely individuals recognize the change in themselves. The mind adapted to its altered state as if it were normal, adjusting expectations downward, narrowing perspective. From inside the experience, behavior felt reasonable. From outside, it appeared increasingly unstable. These stories remain part of the continent's human record, not as cautionary tales filled with drama, but as reminders of how deeply environment shapes cognition. Antarctica challenges not only survival, but self-regulation. It asks the mind to operate without the familiar signals that keep it balanced. When those signals vanish for too long, even strong individuals may drift away from themselves, quietly and without intention, in a place where there is little to interrupt that drift once it begins. There came moments when machines were no longer an option. Engines fell silent, aircraft could not return, and vehicles froze where they stood. In those moments, expeditions faced a narrowing set of choices. Staying meant waiting for a rescue that might never arrive. Leaving meant stepping into a landscape that offers no scale, no shelter, and no assurance of distance. Some chose to walk. At first, the idea seemed reasonable. Maps showed routes, supplies were counted carefully. Each step forward felt like movement towards safety rather than surrender. The ground appeared flat, the horizon steady, the surface firm beneath boots. What lay ahead looked no different from what lay behind, and that sameness encouraged persistence. Walking in Antarctica alters the body quietly. Cold drains warmth faster than motion can replace it. Muscles stiffen, joints resist bending, and breathing grows shallow in air that feels thin and dry. Even fully equipped travelers notice strength fading sooner than expected. Loads feel heavier with each passing hour. Progress slows without announcement. Distance behaves strangely. Without landmarks, miles lose meaning. A ridge that appears close remains distant, far longer than it should. Time stretches as effort increases. Crews push on, believing they are nearly there, guided by estimates made in conditions that no longer apply. The surface remains uniform, offering no sign of advancement beyond the rhythm of footsteps. Wind adds a constant tax. Katabatic flows descend from the interior, pressing against bodies and stealing heat. Snow scours exposed skin. Vision narrows as goggles frost and breath crystallizes. Stopping becomes dangerous. Standing still allows cold to settle deep into clothing and muscle, making rest indistinguishable from decline. Energy disappears quickly. Calories burn at a pace unfamiliar to those who have not experienced prolonged cold exertion. Food freezes solid. Water must be melted, a task requiring fuel and time. Dehydration arrives unnoticed, thickening blood and dulling thought. Decision making slows. Simple choices feel complex. The body continues forward even as judgment weakens. The ice itself offers hidden resistance. Sastrugi, ridges sculpted by wind, catch skis, and trip boots. Snow varies in density, sometimes firm, sometimes powdery enough to swallow steps. Each variation steals momentum. Beneath thin layers, crevasses may lie concealed, forcing careful probing that further slows travel. The route demands constant attention in conditions that sap concentration. Some expeditions turned back toward the last known shelter, others aimed for distant stations or supply caches marked on maps. In both cases, the margin for error was nearly non existent. A storm arriving early erased tracks within minutes. Visibility collapsed, and orientation vanished with it. Walking in circles became a real possibility, unnoticed until exhaustion made correction impossible. When progress stopped, it was rarely dramatic. People sat down to rest and found it difficult to stand again. Hands lost feeling. Movements grew deliberate and slow. Companions assisted one another until strength ran out evenly. The cold did not rush, it waited. What remains of these attempts are records that end in motion rather than arrival. Notes written with steady handwriting, calculations of distance and food, observations of weather that feel ordinary given what followed. The choice to walk back reflects determination rather than despair, a belief that human effort might close the gap left by failed machines. Antarctica rarely allows that belief to last. The continent is scaled for ice, not bodies. Walking exposes limits that technology often disguises. Without speed, shelter, and mechanical support, distance expands and time contracts. Those who tried discovered that the land does not meet travelers halfway. It remains what it is, vast and impartial, while footsteps fade behind them almost as soon as they are made. Some Antarctic expeditions did not vanish all at once. They faded slowly from record, stretching absence across years, then decades, until their names settled into history as unresolved presences. These groups departed with schedules, plans, and expectations shaped by the knowledge of their time. When they did not return, the world waited, assuming delay rather than loss. Early reports spoke of optimism. Supplies had been sufficient, routes were reasonable, weather windows, though narrow, existed. As months passed without word, concern surfaced gently rather than urgently. Ships could be trapped for long winters. Sled teams might overwinter beyond contact. Antarctica allowed explanations that postponed alarm. Time deepened uncertainty. Search efforts were mounted when conditions allowed, but they were limited in reach and duration. Crews scanned coastlines and inland routes based on last known intentions rather than confirmed locations. The continent offered little guidance. Snowfall erased tracks, ice rearranged familiar landmarks. Years later, even the memory of where to look had shifted. Records from these expeditions often end cleanly. Logbooks describe steady progress, routine observations, and calm assessment of surroundings. There is no signal of crisis. The tone remains measured until it stops entirely. This absence of escalation contributed to the long wait, reinforcing the idea that the expeditions were simply beyond reach rather than gone. Decades passed before fragments emerged, when they emerged at all. A cairn appeared far from expected routes. A note surfaced inside weathered metal. Equipment was found preserved beneath layers of snow, its placement deliberate rather than accidental. These discoveries did not resolve stories. They expanded them, suggesting endurance beyond presumed limits and movement far beyond planned paths. Ice played a central role in this prolonged disappearance. As it flowed, it carried camps and bodies away from their original positions. Coastal areas changed shape as shelves advanced and fractured. Inland routes became unrecognizable. What searchers might have found shortly after loss became unreachable years later, sealed deep within a moving archive. In some cases, remains were uncovered generations later, lifted briefly into visibility by shifting ice or melting edges. Clothing lay neatly arranged, tools rested where they had last been used. The stillness suggested a pause rather than an ending. Exposure had not scattered these traces, it had preserved them, then hidden them again. The length of absence reshaped perception. These expeditions moved from rescue efforts into legend, then into quiet acknowledgement. They were spoken of carefully, without embellishment. The gap between departure and discovery grew too wide for resolution to feel complete. Antarctica retained most of the story for itself. What distinguishes these longest lost expeditions is not simply time, but continuity. The land did not reject them violently, it accepted them slowly, integrating their presence into its own movement. Their paths became part of ice flow, their camps became part of accumulation, their names remained on lists long after any physical trace was beyond reach. Modern understanding allows clearer reconstruction, yet limits remain. Satellite imagery reveals changes, but not details. Radar shows shapes beneath ice, but not stories. The continent still holds more than it offers back. For expeditions missing for decades, that imbalance endures. These long absences remind us that Antarctica measures human effort differently. Time there stretches and compresses in unfamiliar ways. What feels like resolution elsewhere becomes continuation here. The longest lost expeditions did not simply end. They extended into the ice, their journeys carried forward quietly, beyond sight, leaving behind a silence that lasted long enough to become part of the continent itself. Years after loss becomes accepted, Antarctica sometimes loosens its hold. Ice shifts, surfaces thin, and what was once sealed away approaches daylight again. These moments rarely arrive with announcement. They appear quietly, noticed first as irregular shapes on otherwise smooth ground, or as faint outlines where uniform white has been gently interrupted. Aircraft emerge slowly. A wingtip surfaces first, dark against snow bleached by time. Nearby, fragments follow, softened by wind and ice, their edges rounded rather than torn. Paint remains surprisingly intact, colors muted but recognizable. Metal shows little corrosion, bolts still hold. Inside cockpits, instruments sit where they were last read, needles frozen in place, switches untouched. The scene feels paused rather than destroyed. Camps appear with similar stillness. Fabric tents rise from the snow like low hills, before seams and poles give them shape again. Wooden structures surface piece by piece, a corner of a wall, the frame of a doorway. Floors remain level, protected beneath ice that collapsed inward long ago. Inside, personal items lie where they were placed. Mugs rest on shelves. Notebooks wait open on desks. Time has moved forward, yet these spaces seem anchored to a single day. Cold plays a role in this preservation. Without moisture and warmth, decay slows dramatically. Organic material remains intact far longer than expected. Paper yellows but does not disintegrate. Food tins hold their shape. Textiles stiffen but do not rot. The absence of insects and bacteria reshapes the usual process of ruin, replacing it with suspension. What often strikes those who find these wrecks is how little violence they display. There are no burn marks from impact fires, no scattered debris fields stretched across distance. Objects remain close together, suggesting controlled endings rather than chaos. Snow cushioned landings, ice absorbed momentum. The continent accepted these arrivals gently, then covered them with patience. Discovery does not restore context. A plane resting on ice does not explain why it came down. A camp resurfacing does not clarify why it was abandoned. The landscape offers artifacts without narrative. Researchers document positions, photograph details, and record conditions, careful not to disturb what has remained undisturbed for so long. Once exposed, these sites rarely stay visible. Snow drifts return, ice continues to move. What surfaces one season may vanish the next. In some cases, wrecks are relocated for study or safety. In others, they are left where they appear, allowed to resume their slow journey within the ice. Seeing these remains alters the sense of time. Past and present overlap without blending. Equipment from decades ago appears functional, familiar, yet distant. The people associated with it feel close in their absence. The space holds evidence of life without reflecting passage. These moments of reappearance remind us that Antarctica does not erase in the usual way. It stores, it rearranges, it releases selectively, according to its own rhythms. What is found again has not returned from elsewhere. It has been here all along, waiting beneath layers that finally shifted. When the surface smooths once more, the continent looks unchanged. The brief interruption fades. Memory remains in records and images, while the physical site slips back into whiteness. Antarctica gives these glimpses sparingly, allowing only fragments to resurface before folding them away again, preserving the balance between what is revealed and what remains held beneath the ice. When a human body comes to rest in Antarctica, it enters an environment unlike any other on Earth. Change does not follow familiar timelines. Processes that usually act quickly slow to a near pause, while others continue with quiet persistence. What happens next depends not on intention, but on position, temperature, movement, and time. In the coldest, driest regions of the continent, preservation can be remarkable. Low humidity limits the presence of bacteria and insects that normally break down organic tissue. Temperatures remain far below freezing for most of the year, preventing chemical reactions that drive decay. In these conditions, bodies freeze rapidly and remain that way. Skin hardens, features soften but remain recognizable. Clothing stays intact. The body becomes less a biological process and more a physical object held in suspension. This preservation is not dramatic. There is no sense of timeless perfection. Instead, there is stillness. Ice and cold hold everything exactly as it was at the moment movement stopped. Personal items remain where they fell. Posture remains unchanged. Time passes without leaving visible marks, and the body becomes part of the frozen surroundings rather than something distinct within them. Other environments produce different outcomes. In coastal regions and areas with more active ice flow, bodies may not remain visible for long. Snow drifts accumulate steadily, covering surfaces layer by layer. A body left exposed one season may be buried the next, sealed beneath compacting snow that turns gradually into ice. Once encased, movement begins. The ice carries its contents slowly, changing position without breaking form. Over longer periods, pressure alters preservation. Ice compresses what it holds. Limbs may shift, structures flatten, materials fracture slowly under weight. The body remains preserved but transformed, no longer resting where it was left. Records tied to surface coordinates lose accuracy as years pass and location becomes uncertain. In some cases, bodies vanish entirely from view. Crevasses offer direct pathways downward, drawing remains into deep, cold darkness where retrieval is impossible. There, preservation may still occur, but without any chance of rediscovery. Elsewhere, ice flows carry remains toward the coast. Over decades or centuries, that ice may calve into the sea. When this happens, contents once held inland are released into water, where preservation ends quickly. The difference between preservation and disappearance is often subtle. A few meters in location can determine outcome, a ridge versus a depression, stable interior ice versus a moving stream, dry cold versus marginal warmth. Antarctica offers no consistent rule, only a system shaped by geography and motion. Even when preservation is long lasting, it is not permanent. Ice continues to move, snow continues to fall, pressure continues to reshape what it encloses. A preserved body may remain intact for decades, then disappear without warning as conditions shift. Emergence is possible, but unpredictable. When remains resurface, it is usually brief, a moment between burial and concealment dictated by ice thinning or surface change. What stands out most is how impersonally this process unfolds. There is no distinction made between objects and people. The ice treats all weight the same. It holds, moves, compresses, and releases according to forces far older and larger than any single story. In Antarctica, bodies are neither quickly returned to the land nor erased outright. They enter a slow cycle governed by cold, gravity, and flow. Some remain preserved as silent witnesses. Others are carried away beyond reach. Both outcomes belong to the same system, one that does not hurry, does not pause, and does not remember in the way humans do, even as it quietly holds what they leave behind. Antarctica does not remove evidence through sudden destruction. It dissolves it through steady processes that never stop working. Snowfall, ice flow, and wind combine into a system that softens edges, fills gaps, and redistributes everything left behind. What disappears here does so gradually, becoming part of the continent's constant rearrangement. Snowfall begins the process quietly. Unlike storms elsewhere, much of Antarctica's accumulation arrives as fine grains carried sideways by wind. These particles settle into depressions, corners, and footprints, leveling differences until surfaces appear even. Each layer compresses the one beneath it, pressing air out and binding crystals together. Over time, light snow becomes firm snow, then dense ice. Evidence left on the surface sinks rather than stays exposed. This compaction happens without drama. Objects remain visible for a while, then partially, then not at all. The outline of a track fades. The shape of a camp blends into surrounding drifts. The color of exposed material dulls under frost. Snow does not bury things with weight alone, it buries them with repetition, arriving again and again until nothing stands apart. Wind accelerates this erasure. Antarctica's winds do not simply blow across the surface, they sculpt it. Katabatic flows descend from the interior, polishing ice and redistributing snow into ridges and troughs that migrate constantly. These winds strip exposed areas clean while deepening accumulation in others. A site uncovered one week may be buried the next, not because of snowfall, but because snow was moved there from far away. Wind also abrades. Fine ice particles travel at speed, sanding surfaces smooth, edges round off, markings fade, paint peels gently rather than flakes. Over time, this polishing removes contrast, making objects blend visually into the surrounding ice even before they disappear beneath it. Ice flow completes the process. Once snow becomes ice, it joins a slow movement driven by gravity and pressure. This movement is subtle, but it never pauses. Anything sealed within the ice is carried along, changing position year by year. Coordinates tied to the surface lose meaning as the surface itself shifts. What was once centered becomes displaced, and what was nearby grows distant. As ice flows, it also deforms. Layers bend and stretch. Cracks open and close. Objects within are compressed and redistributed. Evidence spreads out, fractures, and becomes harder to recognize as a single event. The ice does not keep scenes intact. It breaks them apart and rearranges them across time and space. Together, these forces remove sharpness from the past. There are no ruins that linger clearly. There are no preserved paths to follow backward. Antarctica replaces memory with smoothness. Even major disturbances fade as the surface seeks uniformity again. This erasure is not selective. Scientific equipment, personal belongings, and natural features all submit to the same process. The continent does not distinguish between signal and noise. It levels everything equally, guided by physics rather than meaning. What remains after this work is not emptiness, but continuity. The land carries forward without interruption, absorbing traces into its own movement. Snow falls, wind shifts, ice flows, and the surface resets. Evidence becomes depth, events become layers, time becomes something you can only infer rather than see. This is why Antarctica holds so few visible answers, not because nothing happened, but because the place is structured to forget appearances. It preserves within itself while removing signs from view, allowing the surface to remain calm and unmarked, even as countless stories lie folded beneath, indistinguishable from the ice that holds them. In the modern era, Antarctica is watched more closely than ever before. Satellites trace weather systems hours before they arrive. GPS coordinates fix position within meters. Aircraft follow digital routes. Communications circle the globe in moments. From a distance, the continent appears finally mapped, finally measured, finally contained by technology that promises certainty. And yet, people still vanish. Modern expeditions move with precision. Every journey is planned around narrow windows of safety. Fuel calculations are exact. Check-ins are scheduled. Equipment is tested repeatedly before departure. These layers of preparation create confidence, not arrogance, but the belief that error can be minimized to manageable margins. Antarctica responds by reshaping those margins quietly. Technology depends on continuity. Satellites require clear lines of sight. GPS signals weaken near the poles where orbital paths flatten. Magnetic interference shifts subtly with solar activity, bending data just enough to matter. Instruments remain accurate, but interpretation grows fragile when conditions change faster than systems can adjust. Weather remains the primary variable. Forecasts improve yearly, yet Antarctica generates its own systems locally. Whiteouts form beneath clear skies. Winds accelerate without warning as cold air descends from the interior. Storms stall flights for days. What begins as a short delay extends into isolation as fuel, warmth, and power diminish. Movement remains a risk even with guidance. Vehicles follow mapped routes across ice that continues to flow beneath them. A path safe one season can fracture the next. GPS marks where something was, not where the surface will be. Crevasse fields migrate, snow bridges weaken invisibly. The margin between travel and immobilization stays thin. Aircraft face their own limits. Instrument approaches help, but landing still depends on visual confirmation and surface conditions. Runways shift, ice softens, wind patterns distort descent. When aircraft divert or turn back, options narrow quickly. The distance between locations is vast, and alternatives are few. Human judgment remains part of every system. Fatigue alters reaction time. Cold narrows attention. Repetition dulls caution. Small decisions, reasonable in isolation, combine into trajectories that cannot be corrected once underway. Technology assists, but it does not replace awareness, and awareness erodes subtly under constant exposure. Search efforts today mobilize faster and wider than in the past. Satellites scan terrain, aircraft sweep grids, ground teams deploy with precision. Even so, the landscape absorbs evidence at a pace that surprises modern expectations. Tracks fade within hours. Wreckage buries quickly. Coordinates lose relevance as ice moves. Modern accidents often leave fewer visible signs than older ones. Lighter equipment disperses more easily. Aircraft break apart into pieces that sink or scatter. Camps pack down neatly when abandoned. There is rarely a dramatic site to locate, only absence marked by data logs that stop updating. What makes these vanishings unsettling is not mystery, but familiarity. The systems involved are known, the procedures are correct, the people are skilled. The losses occur not from ignorance, but from convergence. Weather, terrain, and limitation align briefly, and the opportunity for correction disappears. Antarctica remains unchanged by these advances. It does not challenge technology directly. It simply operates at a scale and pace that technology cannot fully compress. Distance still matters. Time still narrows options. Ice still moves. Modern tools reduce risk, but they do not eliminate it. They create clarity without removing uncertainty. People still vanish, not because they were unprepared, but because preparation has limits here. The continent allows entry under careful conditions, then resumes its own rhythms, quietly and efficiently, leaving even the most advanced systems tracing gaps where movement once occurred and where nothing returns to fill the space. Antarctica remains dangerous, not because it resists progress, but because it exceeds it. Technology has shortened distances, sharpened forecasts, and refined movement, yet the continent operates on scales that do not compress easily. Its cold is not an obstacle to be bypassed. It is a condition that reshapes every system brought into it. Temperature defines the first limit. Extreme cold alters materials at a fundamental level, narrowing tolerances until performance depends on constant intervention. Warmth must be manufactured and maintained without interruption. Any lapse, however brief, changes how engines turn, how batteries respond, how seals hold. Technology compensates, but only while energy flows steadily. When that flow weakens, even momentarily, systems revert toward stillness. Weather adds uncertainty that prediction cannot fully dissolve. Models describe broad patterns well, yet Antarctica generates local behavior shaped by ice, elevation, and sudden air movement. Katabatic winds descend with force that accelerates faster than response times allow. Whiteouts form without clear boundaries. Storms linger longer than expected. These shifts do not defeat forecasting, but they outrun the margins within which action remains possible. Distance remains the quiet constraint beneath everything else. Antarctica is far from replacement parts, far from hospitals, far from redundancy. Logistics stretch across oceans and seasons. A single missed delivery reshapes plans for months. Rescue exists, but it is not immediate. It depends on weather aligning, machines starting, and routes remaining open. Time becomes a factor that cannot be engineered away. The surface itself refuses to stay fixed. Ice flows, fractures, and settles continuously. Maps describe a moment rather than a promise. A safe path becomes provisional. A runway becomes uneven. A camp's foundation becomes uncertain. Technology tracks movement, but it cannot halt it. Any structure built on ice inherits that motion and must adapt constantly or be abandoned. Human limits persist alongside mechanical ones. Cold narrows focus. Fatigue lengthens response. Isolation distorts perception. Training mitigates these effects, yet does not erase them. Decision making remains a human process shaped by environment. Technology supports judgment, but it does not replace it, and judgment degrades subtly when conditions persist without relief. Communication, though improved, remains fragile. Polar regions stretch satellite coverage and complicate signal paths. Interference arrives unseen. Equipment functions, then fades. When contact weakens, coordination slows, and delay compounds risk. Silence does not need to be total to matter. Partial loss is enough to break continuity. There is also the matter of scale. Antarctica does not present danger in isolated pockets. It extends it everywhere. There is no nearby refuge to retreat to, no alternative route just beyond the horizon. The landscape offers few compromises. It accepts presence conditionally, then withdraws that permission as circumstances change. What technology cannot fix is the continent's indifference. Machines assume stability somewhere in the system. Antarctica offers none reliably. Ice moves, weather shifts, cold persists, distance remains. Every solution adds complexity, and complexity introduces new points of failure. Safety improves, but certainty does not. This is why Antarctica continues to claim time, effort, and sometimes lives, even in the modern era, not through spectacle or surprise, but through accumulation. Small stresses align, margins narrow, recovery becomes harder than endurance. The danger here is not a single threat waiting to be solved. It is the combination of many forces operating calmly and continuously. Technology keeps pace for a while. Then, the continent reasserts itself, not aggressively, but completely, reminding anyone who enters that progress here is temporary, conditional, and always subject to a place that remains larger than every system built to understand it. Studying Antarctica has always required more than curiosity. It demands commitment, measured in time, preparation, and personal risk. Every journey south is built around trade-offs, balancing what can be learned against what must be endured to learn it. Scientists understand these costs before they arrive, yet they continue to come, drawn not by ease, but by importance. Antarctica holds records unavailable anywhere else on Earth. Ice cores preserve atmospheres that no longer exist, layers of air sealed thousands of years ago. Snowfall captures traces of volcanic eruptions, solar variation, and shifting climate. Beneath the ice lie clues to continental movement and ancient ecosystems. These archives are fragile and remote, accessible only through direct presence. Data cannot be gathered without entering the environment that protects it. Reaching these sites requires long planning. Equipment must function reliably in extreme cold. Teams train for months, sometimes years, learning survival skills alongside scientific methods. Once in place, work unfolds slowly. Drilling progresses centimeter by centimeter. Instruments are calibrated repeatedly. Every task consumes energy in conditions where energy is costly to replace. The physical toll is constant but subtle. Cold strains the body even during rest. Simple movements demand more effort. Recovery takes longer. Illness behaves differently. Healing slowed by temperature and isolation. Medical support exists, but it is limited. Evacuation remains uncertain, shaped by weather and distance rather than urgency alone. Psychological strain accompanies physical effort. Long periods away from family and familiar environments narrow emotional range. Communication home is delayed or brief. The landscape offers little variation, and workdays blend together. Purpose provides focus, but focus alone does not erase fatigue. Scientists rely on routine and teamwork to maintain balance in a place that resists both. Risk remains present even during careful work. Weather shifts interrupt schedules. Equipment fails despite testing. Ice moves beneath camps and runways. Each decision must account for conditions that can change faster than plans adapt. Caution governs daily choices, yet it cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely. Why endure this? Because the insights gained reshape understanding far beyond the ice. Antarctic research informs climate models used worldwide. It clarifies how oceans circulate, how ice sheets respond to warming, how ecosystems adapt to extremes. Discoveries made here influence policy, preparation, and perception everywhere else. The value extends beyond individual careers or single expeditions. There is also continuity. Scientists return to sites measured decades earlier, building long records that reveal slow change. These comparisons require patience across generations. One team begins what another will finish. Knowledge accumulates through persistence rather than speed. For many, there is also respect for the place itself. Antarctica strips science down to essentials. There are no shortcuts. Results come only through endurance and attention. In that simplicity, work feels grounded. The environment demands humility, reminding researchers that observation carries responsibility. Losses are acknowledged within this community. Accidents are remembered. Protocols evolve. Safety improves incrementally, shaped by experience rather than assumption. Yet acceptance remains that absolute safety is unattainable here. The decision to go is made with full awareness of that fact. Scientists keep returning because some questions cannot be answered remotely. They accept the cost because the absence of knowledge carries its own risks. Understanding Earth's systems, past and present, requires access to its most extreme places. Antarctica offers clarity unavailable elsewhere, preserved in ice and silence. The work continues, not because danger is ignored, but because meaning outweighs comfort. Each season adds to a record larger than any single journey. In that quiet exchange between risk and understanding, Antarctica remains a place where science advances slowly, deliberately, and with respect for the forces that shape both the planet and those who study it. The history of Antarctica is written as much in absence as in discovery. Each loss added weight to the understanding that survival here could never rely on bravery or experience alone. Over time, patterns emerged from incidents once thought isolated. Tragedies became lessons, not through explanation alone, but through careful change applied quietly and persistently. Early expeditions often depended on endurance and intuition. As losses accumulated, it became clear that success required systems built for failure rather than optimism. Safety planning shifted from best case assumptions to worst case preparation. Routes were reconsidered, margins widened, decisions slowed. What once felt cautious became standard practice. One of the first changes came through communication. Regular check ins replaced open ended schedules. Silence gained meaning. Missed signals triggered responses rather than patience. Redundant systems were added, not to improve convenience, but to preserve continuity when primary links faded. This reduced uncertainty, even when it could not eliminate it. Navigation evolved as well. Routes became conservative by design, favoring predictability over efficiency. Known hazards were avoided, even at cost of time. Historical records were consulted carefully, acknowledging how quickly landscapes change. Planning accepted that maps age rapidly and that judgment must adjust continuously rather than follow fixed lines. Equipment followed the same logic. Designs favored simplicity over complexity. Machines were built to fail gradually rather than suddenly. Heating systems included backups. Power was distributed rather than centralized. Materials were chosen for cold tolerance rather than strength alone. Maintenance became a constant process rather than a scheduled one. Training shifted focus. Physical fitness remained important, but psychological preparation gained equal weight. Crews learned to recognize early signs of fatigue, stress, and cognitive narrowing. Team dynamics were addressed openly. Rest was treated as essential, not optional. These changes acknowledge that human limits are part of the environment rather than separate from it. Medical protocols adjusted to isolation. Crews trained in advanced care normally handled by hospitals. Supplies were expanded beyond immediate need. Evacuation planning became more realistic, accepting that extraction might not be immediate or possible. This reframed response around stabilization rather than rescue alone. Weather awareness deepened, forecasting tools improved, but interpretation became more cautious. Expeditions learned to treat good conditions as temporary and bad conditions as persistent. Decisions favored retreat sooner rather than later. Waiting became an active choice rather than a delay. Perhaps the most important lesson was humility. Losses showed that Antarctica does not respond to pressure or persistence. It responds only to physics. Safety strategies stopped trying to overcome the environment and instead worked within its constraints. Success became defined not by distance covered or data collected, but by return achieved. These adaptations did not remove risk, they redistributed it. Each generation inherited practices shaped by those who did not come back. Procedures now standard were once innovations introduced reluctantly after loss. Over time, these changes reduced incidents, even as activity increased. Remembering loss became part of preparation. Names entered training materials and briefings, not as warnings, but as context. Their experiences informed choices made far later by people who never met them. In this way, absence continued to guide presence. Antarctica taught these lessons slowly. It did not demand change through spectacle. It allowed enough time between events for reflection, then reminded explorers again when patterns were ignored. What emerged was not mastery, but respect. Safety here grew not from control, but from listening to what the continent had already shown. Through accumulated loss, Antarctica shaped a culture of care measured in caution and patience. The landscape remained unchanged, but human approach did not. Each tragedy refined understanding, turning experience into structure and memory into practice, allowing future work to continue more quietly, more deliberately, and with greater awareness of the costs already paid. Across Antarctica, there are regions that remain deliberately untouched, not because they are unknown, but because they are known well enough to be avoided. These places exist beyond routine routes and seasonal corridors, marked quietly on maps with caution rather than invitation. Their absence from human paths is intentional, shaped by experience rather than curiosity. Some of these zones are defined by ice behavior that resists prediction. Ice streams accelerate unevenly, their surfaces appearing stable, while internal movement stretches and fractures what lies beneath. Crevasse fields form and migrate, opening and closing without visible warning. Snow bridges conceal depth with deceptive smoothness. Even experienced teams recognize when conditions move beyond manageable risk. Other areas are shaped by geography buried out of sight. Mountain ranges hidden beneath kilometers of ice redirect wind and influence snowfall, creating localized extremes. Aircraft encounter sudden turbulence above unseen slopes. Ground teams face gradients that alter travel physics without visual cues. In these regions, technology provides data, but not reassurance. Distance compounds danger. Some locations sit too far from established support to allow recovery if something goes wrong. Fuel margins narrow, communication weakens. Rescue windows close quickly with weather shifts. Planning accounts for return as carefully as arrival, and these places stretch that balance beyond acceptable limits. The cost of access outweighs the value of presence. Weather patterns isolate additional zones. Persistent winds scour surfaces into hard ice that resists anchoring and travel. Other areas collect snow relentlessly, burying landmarks and flattening contrast. Visibility collapses not during storms, but under clear skies when light reflects uniformly. Orientation fails without warning, and navigation loses reference. Environmental protection also plays a role. Some places are left untouched to preserve fragile records. Ancient ice, rare microbial ecosystems, and pristine geological formations exist in states easily altered by brief human presence. Protection protocols restrict access, acknowledging that not all knowledge requires contact. There is a cumulative understanding behind these exclusions. Each decision reflects lessons learned where approach brought consequences. Maps update not only with discoveries, but with boundaries. Areas transition from possible to impractical, from unexplored to deliberately unvisited. The choice to avoid these places is not surrender, it is recognition. Antarctica rewards patience and restraint as much as ambition. By defining limits, explorers and scientists preserve the ability to work elsewhere safely. Focus shifts toward regions where questions can be answered without crossing thresholds of unacceptable risk. These empty zones remind us that exploration is selective. Not every space requires footprint or measurement. Some places serve a different role, existing as constants that shape weather, ice flow, and balance across the continent without direct observation. Silence in these regions is maintained deliberately. No camps interrupt the surface, no tracks mark passage. Over time, this absence becomes part of the landscape's stability. The ice continues its movement without disturbance. Wind patterns remain unaltered. Data is inferred indirectly through models and distant instruments rather than presence. In a place defined by extremes, restraint becomes a form of respect. Knowing where not to go preserves both people and purpose. Antarctica does not demand total access. It offers enough knowledge without requiring every boundary to be crossed. These never visited zones stand as reminders that danger here is not a challenge to overcome, but a condition to acknowledge. Human reach has limits, and acknowledging them allows the rest of the continent to remain accessible. By leaving some places untouched, Antarctica stays a space where work continues thoughtfully, guided by the understanding that absence can be as meaningful as arrival. Antarctica appears exposed, a continent laid bare under light and wind. In reality, it is layered, sealed, and continuously rearranged. What remains hidden does so not through concealment, but through accumulation. Ice builds patiently, preserving depth rather than detail, turning history into thickness rather than surface marks. Most of the continent's information lies downward, not outward. Snowfall stacks memory vertically, compressing seasons into meters, centuries into kilometers. Each layer records conditions at the moment it fell, then locks them away beneath the next arrival. What is visible represents only the present moment. Everything else waits below. Movement contributes to this secrecy. Ice flows outward from the interior in vast, slow streams, carrying whatever it holds far from its point of origin. Objects, landscapes, and evidence migrate over years and centuries, separating cause from location. Discovery becomes a matter of timing rather than searching. Something found today may not belong to where it appears. Pressure transforms as much as it preserves. As layers deepen, air is squeezed into bubbles, then flattened further until records shift from physical form to chemical trace. What remains readable does so only through careful extraction and interpretation, meaning survives, but not in obvious shapes. Light also plays a role. Antarctica's brightness disguises detail. Snow reflects evenly, flattening contrast and depth perception. Features that would stand out elsewhere dissolve into uniformity here. Valleys vanish. Ridges blend. The eye learns little from distance, and much remains unseen even when directly observed. Technology peers through ice in limited ways. Radar outlines buried features. Seismic waves hint at hidden structures. Satellites measure surface change precisely, yet these tools translate rather than reveal. They suggest shapes and movement, not stories. Interpretation fills the gaps, guided by inference rather than observation. Some secrets persist simply because access is restricted by necessity. The thickest ice covers the most remote interior. Reaching it requires years of planning and resources. Each expedition chooses focus carefully, leaving most areas untouched. Knowledge expands selectively, shaped by feasibility rather than curiosity alone. Time also guards what remains hidden. Ice that entombs landscapes and objects does not release them on human schedules. Emergence depends on melting, flow, and fracture aligning briefly. What surfaces does so without pattern. What stays buried may do so indefinitely, not through design, but through balance. Biology adds another layer. Microbial life persists within ice, adapting slowly to extreme conditions. These ecosystems are subtle, sparse, and difficult to detect. Their presence challenges assumptions about where life can exist, yet studying them risks altering what makes them unique. Caution slows revelation. There is also restraint. Some knowledge remains hidden because it must. Preserving the integrity of Antarctic systems requires limits. Not all ice should be drilled. Not all areas should be entered. Secrecy here is sometimes protection rather than absence. What remains unseen is not empty. It is active, moving, recording and preserving continuously. Ice remembers without displaying. It carries forward information without explanation. The surface offers calm and simplicity, while complexity deepens below. In this way, Antarctica stays incomplete by design of nature, not oversight. It allows enough to be learned to matter, while retaining vast portions of itself beyond reach. The secrets it holds are not waiting to be revealed all at once. They are distributed across depth, distance, and time. The ice still holds what it has always held, quietly and without intention. It keeps layers aligned, stories compressed, and answers deferred. What we know comes from patience. What we do not know remains present beneath the surface, shaped not by mystery, but by a system that values continuity over exposure and depth over display. Beneath Antarctica's surface lies a quiet inventory, not catalogued in lists, but carried within ice that never stops moving. What may still be buried is not frozen in place so much as suspended, traveling slowly through depth and time. The continent holds ships, planes, camps, and people not as relics, but as contents woven into its structure. Ships rest where sea ice closed around them and never fully released its grip. Some are held near former coastlines, now reshaped by advancing shelves. Others were carried outward, trapped within pack ice that drifted until hulls were sealed beneath accumulation. Wood and metal persist differently here. Planks darken but endure. Frames bend gradually under pressure rather than snapping. These vessels do not lie on the seabed alone. Many remain entombed within ice itself, migrating slowly toward calving fronts that may not reach open water for centuries. Aircraft follow similar paths of concealment. Some came down gently, skimming surfaces softened by snow, leaving intact outlines later buried by drift. Others fractured, their pieces distributed across small areas that were quickly leveled by wind. Aluminum resists corrosion in the cold. Fabric stiffens rather than decays. Instruments remain readable long after power ceased. Buried planes may rest surprisingly whole, hidden beneath meters of ice that record seasons above them like pages laid shut. Camps occupy an intermediate state. Built on ice or shallow snow, they were designed to be temporary, yet many outlasted expectations. Structures collapse inward under weight rather than outward from force. Tents flatten, walls bow, floors sink evenly. Over time, camps become layers, each generation of snow pressing the last deeper into uniformity. Inside, tools remain ordered. Personal items sit where they were last placed. The boundary between interior and exterior disappears as snow fills both equally. People are held most quietly of all. Some were buried where they fell, quickly covered by drift that insulated and preserved. Others were carried downward into crevasses, removed from surface processes almost immediately. In moving ice, bodies change position slowly, displaced without disturbance. Their presence alters nothing on the surface. No marker indicates passage. The land remains smooth. These categories overlap as ice moves. A ship becomes inland ice, then coastal ice, then ocean. A camp migrates laterally as layers above push and pull. An aircraft shifts orientation as pressure reshapes its surroundings. Separation between object and environment dissolves. Everything buried becomes part of a single system governed by accumulation and flow. What remains unknown is not the presence of these things, but their arrangement. Locations recorded once lose meaning as ice carries contents away from original coordinates. The continent stores without indexing. Discovery depends on chance alignment, thinning ice, shifting wind, or deliberate exploration guided by inference rather than certainty. Some of what is buried may never surface. Ice thickens in places where movement slows, sealing contents deeper rather than releasing them. Balance stabilizes. Layers remain intact. Time stretches beyond human planning. Other items will emerge briefly, then vanish again as surfaces reset. The idea of burial here is misleading. Nothing is fixed beneath the surface. Everything is in transit. Antarctica does not hide by locking things away. It hides by keeping them moving, always just out of reach, always part of a larger motion that ignores significance. What may still be buried is not waiting, it is being carried. Ships, planes, camps, and people exist as quiet passengers within the ice, preserved without display. The continent holds them without judgment or intent, folding human presence into its own long rhythms, where memory is stored as depth and distance, and where what remains unseen remains entirely real. Despite everything already carried into the ice, people continue to return to Antarctica, not with urgency and not with conquest in mind, but with a steady willingness to approach something larger than themselves. The reasons are not singular. They overlap gently, shaped by curiosity, shaped by science, and shaped by the quiet pull of what has not yet been seen. Human curiosity is the first current. It does not rush, it lingers. Antarctica offers a scale of emptiness rare on Earth, a place where the absence of detail invites attention rather than distraction. The landscape resists quick understanding. It does not explain itself at a glance. That resistance draws the mind forward, encouraging observation instead of assumption. Curiosity here is not excitement, but patience. Science deepens that pull by giving it purpose. Antarctica connects directly to systems that shape the entire planet. Ice reflects sunlight, cooling oceans far beyond its borders. Winds born here influence circulation patterns thousands of kilometers away. Snowfall records climate history with a precision unmatched elsewhere. Studying this place means understanding processes that reach into every environment humans inhabit. The work requires presence. Instruments must be placed carefully. Samples must be collected deliberately. Measurements must be repeated across years to reveal change. No satellite alone can replace the quiet accuracy of hands working steadily in the cold. Science here remains grounded, literal, and slow, shaped by conditions that reward care. There is also continuity. Each expedition builds on those before it. Data gains meaning through comparison, not immediacy. Returning allows long records to form, revealing shifts too subtle to notice within a single season. The value lies in return itself, in showing up again to measure the same ice, the same wind, the same silence, and noticing what has changed. Beyond science, there is the pull of the unknown. Antarctica does not hide everything, but it withholds enough to remain unfinished. Beneath the ice are landscapes never seen by human eyes. Within the ice are records not yet decoded. Between storms are patterns not fully mapped. The unknown here is not mystery in the dramatic sense. It is incompleteness, a gentle reminder that understanding is always partial. This incompleteness carries respect. Antarctica does not invite mastery, it invites relationship. Returning means acknowledging limits while still approaching. It means working within constraints rather than forcing answers. People go back not because they believe the place will yield entirely, but because it continues to teach without promising resolution. There is also something quieter at work. Antarctica strips experience down to essentials: light, temperature, movement, rest. Days measured by small progress rather than constant output. In that narrowing, attention deepens. The world feels wider precisely because it contains less. Many who return describe a clarity shaped by simplicity rather than isolation. Loss has not ended this return. Instead, it has shaped it. Awareness travels with each new team, carried as protocol and memory. Going back now is done with care refined over decades. Each return honors what came before by proceeding deliberately. In the end, Antarctica is not a destination that completes itself. It remains open ended, layered, and evolving. People return because curiosity still finds room to breathe here. Science still requires answers found only in this cold. The unknown still stretches outward, not as a challenge, but as a quiet invitation. And so the journeys continue, steady and measured, guided by the understanding that some places are worth revisiting not to finish them, but to remain in conversation with them. Antarctica remains, as it has throughout this story, calm on the surface and immense beneath it. Ice stretches outward without urgency, holding its shape against wind and light. From a distance, the continent appears still, almost finished, as if nothing more could happen there. Yet its quiet is active, its silence full of motion. What Antarctica keeps is not taken violently, it is accepted gradually. Ships slowed, then stopped. Camps settled inward. Aircraft came to rest. People lay down where movement ended. Over time, these moments were folded into snow, then into ice, then into depth. The surface smoothed itself and moved on. The continent does not distinguish between what matters and what does not. It receives ambition and care equally. It absorbs mistakes alongside preparation. The land holds without commentary, carrying everything forward within its long cycles of pressure and flow. What disappears does not vanish entirely. It changes state, becoming part of something larger and slower than memory. Those who were kept here are not marked by monuments. There are no standing ruins, no preserved roads leading back to them. Instead, there are coordinates that drift, names that travel through stories, and practices shaped by experience. Their presence endures not through visibility, but through influence. Antarctica does not return things on request. It offers only what its rhythms allow. A wingtip emerges, a camp wall reappears, a note surfaces briefly before snow closes again. These returns are partial, transient, and never complete. The continent does not explain, it does not resolve, it allows glimpses. What remains beneath the ice is vast, and what has been learned from it is equally so. The cold revealed how fragile machines can be. Distance revealed how narrow rescue margins are. Silence revealed how the human mind responds when stripped of reference. Loss revealed how knowledge grows when humility replaces assumption. Through these lessons, the relationship between people and Antarctica changed. The drive to conquer softened into a willingness to observe. The language of victory was replaced by the language of care. Each return carried awareness, shaped by those who did not return. The continent itself remains unchanged by this evolution. Ice continues to fall, compress, and flow. Wind continues to sculpt surfaces into temporary order. Light continues to flatten depth into brightness. Antarctica does not remember individuals, yet it carries their imprint within its layers. To say it never gives everything back is not to accuse it of cruelty, it is to acknowledge balance. Antarctica keeps enough to remain vast, enough to remain unfinished. It leaves space for absence, for respect, for unanswered presence. It reminds us that some places are not meant to be fully known, only approached repeatedly, with patience. Those who study it, travel it, and leave parts of themselves within it, become part of its ongoing story, not as endings, but as layers. Their journeys settle into the ice alongside snowstorms and seasons, indistinguishable in movement, inseparable in time. The white continent holds what it holds quietly. It offers knowledge generously, but not completely. What it keeps without malice, folded into its long memory of cold and motion. And in that restraint, Antarctica remains what it has always been, a place larger than return, where the surface stays calm, the depths continue moving, and the story never fully closes.